Welcome, everybody, to Broadcast Team Alpha, where we bring you cutting-edge conversations while exploring the quantum possibilities. I'm Nori Love, and I am joined by my co-hosts, the handsome and renowned Aage Nost, the rich and famous Tom Schaefer, and we have a phenomenal guest for you today. But before Aage introduces our guest, I'd like to invite you to connect with us. Connect with us at broadcastteamalpha.com, and you can connect with us at YouTube, so you are always notified when our shows are happening, because sometimes we get some spontaneous ones. So we sure do appreciate you being here. And with any further ado, Aage, will you please introduce our amazing guest?
Yes, that will be lovely. This is going to be a phenomenal show. This will keep you on the edge of the chair because we have Peter Moon with us.
Wow.
He is a world traveler, a researcher of the strange and unusual sciences. He's also an author of several books, and several, that means about 17 or more, I think I just found out. And two of them that I know of speaks about the Montauk Project, where they were actually doing time travel experiments and invisibility. And I also have read that they possibly may have created an interdimensional creature that came through into our physical reality, and it was not very friendly. And another book that he has just now issued is Inside the Earth. And that also speaks about the Bugeshi mountain cave in Romania, where an alien race came and left a holographic library for us. So we also have one great interest in common, and that is time travel. He has a website called timetraveleducationcenter.com, and he explains and discusses the science behind time travel, the almost borderline to how to do it.
Wow.
So stay on the edge of the chair, because here I give you Peter Moon. Welcome to Broadcast Team Alpha, Peter.
Hey, welcome, Peter.
Thank you. It's nice to be with you.
Oh, this is going to be so fun. You have written so much, and you have spent so much time doing research here. How did this really, what brought you onto this path? What kept you from being an accountant or something like normal people do?
Well, I had a regular business in ordinary life with my wife, who was a designer. Mm-hmm. And she did the early book covers. We had a Creative Circle, was the name of our company, still is the parent company. It was basically a design firm that evolved into an advertising agency. And it was during that time. So during the process of that, I learned typesetting. Okay, I learned how to typeset. We had our own computer for typesetting. And she had the skills to put together a book. In those days, you didn't have desktop publishing in the early 90s, or few did, where it's an everyday, anybody can do it now. Whether they can do it well or not is another question. So we had all of, and my life was a setup to do this book. Not that I knew it, because that was the publishing end of it. I had been in the movement from 1971, from 19 to 1983, I'd been involved in Scientology, which had to do with mind control, okay? Studying mind control. So the Montauk Project is about mind control. I had a lot of first-hand experience dealing with it in Scientology, basically as somebody who would try and heal the effects, because Scientology was created on the premise that everybody on earth is under the influence of mind control.
Wow.
And of course, it evolved into mind control in and of itself, but that's a separate subject. So that was my background. I also had background doing different businesses and stuff. So it evolved into, when I first met Preston Nichols, who is the primary author of the Montauk Project Experiments in Time, I heard his stories. I went to meet him because he was an inventor. I knew nothing about the Montauk Project. I'd only heard about the Philadelphia experiment once and thought it was utter nonsense, that a ship could disappear, dismissed it. And then I sat down to meet him. And he said, well, if you want to talk to me, you have to wait for the break because I'm here to do a lecture. And with several other people, they were doing a lecture on Earth changes. And they talked about the Montauk Project, the Philadelphia experiment. And there were two people in the room. One of them who was next to me, Al Bielek, Duncan Cameron was the speaker. They claimed to have been involved in the Philadelphia experiment. So all of a sudden it was like hearing a firsthand account of what went on, and then how all of that research had evolved into something on the eastern end of Long Island, Montauk, Camp Hero at Montauk Point. So I was like, all this information, and I said, is there a book? And they said, no, there is no book. So I would visit his laboratory about a week later and become interested. And I attended his lectures for 6 months before I decided to read the book, because there was a lot of apprehension in all the people. It was like meeting in the days of the American Revolution and, you know, the right to assemble. Because you had all this information going. It's not like on the internet today where it's all spilled all over the place.
Right.
Some of it's stupid, some of it's not. And this was like, it was almost like, you know, you're waiting for the government to come in and shut down the meeting.
Yeah, I bet.
That's what it felt like.
I bet. So
it was a lot of fun too.
I bet. I have two questions. So the premise from Scientology that we are all under the control of mind control, is that true? Is that true in your estimation?
Well, I mean, L. Ron Hubbard himself would tell you that no truths are absolute. Because everybody involved in mind control, you know, you grow up, you're born into a body, and society has all these rules and stipulations. When I grew up, starting in 1953, when I was born, so many people were mentally under the influence of the church, the Christian church. So everybody thinks in terms of a very black and white of an idea. I can also tell you we were under the influence of television.
Oh, yeah.
And everybody back then, I think, used to dream in black and white. I remember dreaming in black and white, and I once had a dream in color. And I was telling my kids, my friends about it, or my schoolmates, and they all said I was lying.
Wow.
Because they dreamt in black and white. Because we watched black and white TV. You know, few people had color TVs in the late 50s and early 60s. So that, I mean, it's like, were we under, we're under the influence to where do you want to call the line to where some people behave very programmed, very robotically, and you can even have intelligent people that graduate from privileged universities who don't quite get it on a lot of subjects. So, you know, what is that? Is there, and I've also noticed this with people who are very highly, what do you call it, IQ, their intelligence is relegated to repeating facts.
Interesting.
They don't necessarily, that's not everybody who's graduated from a Ivy League school, but many of them are very intelligent and do incredible things. But some of them are just, they're really good at repeating data, and they can repeat all sorts of data. They can index it, but they might not know anything. You know, they might not how to do anything.
Yeah. They may not know how to apply what they know. That's
right. Exactly. So that's a little bit of background as to what my prerequisites are to getting involved in this. I would also tell you that people were afraid of this subject. It was a great deal of fear and apprehension in the people that were around the core players.
I bet.
Some people were very interested and, you know, would kind of hang on with sort of a groupie mentality. And some of them, but there weren't that many. People were repelled by Preston Nichols for an assortment of reasons. And much of it had to do with fear.
Okay. So, you know, I lived on Long Island, and when I would go to Montauk, not necessarily the town, but when we would go to the beach where there were really no lifeguards, it had a very, I'm very kinesthetic, and it had a really spooky feeling for me. It always did, and that never went away from me. So why Montauk? Why did it happen there?
Well, there's various reasons. The most ostensible practical reason was that it had a huge radar dish that operated at approximately 435 megahertz, which was, according to the research of Preston Nichols, that he had learned, was the window frequency to the human consciousness.
Wow.
And this was the carry forth. So it was very suitable to the researchers because it was originally intended for, it was called the Eastern Shield Defense. It was there, the radar was there to provide a defense to see if there were enemy planes or missiles coming. They would detect them on radar. And this was plugged into a whole network across the United States where they would evaluate, and they would, of course, see UFOs on that radar as well, or had the capacity to see UFOs.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
The interference from the radar dish did not interfere with the 435 megahertz?
Well, that was what was being transmitted from the radar dish.
Oh, from the dish.
From the dish. It's called a gain horn. A radar dish receives and it sends out something through a gain horn where it sends out a signal. And then the signal will hit something, it'll bounce back. And then you read off of it.
Amazing.
It's not going to pick up anything if there's nothing, bouncing back.
Yes.
But the radar was initially there for defense purposes. It had become, by the time the Montauk Project started in approximately 1972, the radar had become antiquated because there was now over-the-horizon radar. They no longer needed it. Mm-hmm. So it was basically a shutdown base. And this was part of the whole conspiracy, was that they were opening up a base and funding it without proper authorized funding. Mm-hmm. And this is what sort of stirred up a lot of, I guess what you call legitimate intrigue and legitimate conspiracy theory, was they were using a base that they had no authorized funding or visible authorized funding. The primary source being attributed to recovered Nazi gold. Right. There were also newspaper accounts of them out there looking for Nazi gold in the East Hampton Star. New York State had approved some gold digging adventures out there. They didn't report to have come up any, but the Nazis are said to have, and in some sources known to have buried gold out there.
Wow.
And so anyway, that is what was a source of funding for the project. And so you had a radar station, and they were using this this radar dish mm-hmm. to amplify thoughts, amplify feelings. You talk about kinesthetic, or what was the word you used?
Kinesthetic, yes.
Kinesthetic. Yeah, you can start transmitting feelings and whatnot mm-hmm. through radar. And that was part of the research that was done in the wake of the Philadelphia experiment, where they would, why did the mind of man go wacky when it would be subjected to certain electromagnetic fields? So this was the study, and they found out that they could transmit emotions, and you could mimic emotions with radar.
Wow.
And then inside the installation, that's where they started experimenting with the time travel projects that they were trying to perfect, wasn't it?
That was the most evolved and exotic aspects of the project, was the time travel. We could also say that's what sort of started the whole thing if we go back to Philadelphia, because when, radio frequency, radar is a form of radio frequency. Right. It's just not the same exact frequency we use on the regular radio. It's all part of the electromagnetic spectrum. So basically, when you begin to zone in on different frequencies, especially when you can connect the mind to and amplify what's in the mind, wow. to focus on it. It's like meditation. If you focus on something, you can really zero in on it. Right. When it's amplified by technology, it becomes stronger. And some people are more sensitive to it than others. So basically by projecting matter, creating ideas, creating matter out of the ether, so to speak, is what one of the chapters is on. So in other words, when you could create things out of matter, they would manifest at different times. Now, all of this stuff, and there's accounts of time travel, and you can meet people who either have or say they've experienced time travel. And the main problem with the subject is becomes the people you're talking to become very incoherent. Preston Nichols could be very incoherent at times. He could also be very genius when it came to a science. He was a legitimate scientist he knew more than most scientists. He could talk very scientifically. At the same time, he was a human experiencer whose experiences caused him a lot of trauma. So sometimes he'd come out with a lot of jumbled things, with wild ass stories and theories.
Yeah.
And the real trick is to mix the two. And it's hard. And Preston didn't always make it easy.
Right.
For example, he passed away in October, and I had seen him, I think it was the previous year. It wasn't that long ago. And when I was redoing this, the Montauk Project, updating it, I added over 120 pages, and we have the silver anniversary edition of the Montauk Project. You know, it's over 25 years old now, 26, going on 27. So I did a new book, and it says in the book, when I'm reading what Preston said, he had signed a 30-year non-disclosure agreement about the Philadelphia experiment. Because when he worked, and I also reveal in this book that the company he worked for was not BGM, as it says in the books. That was a pseudonym for AIL, or Airborne Instruments Laboratory, AIL. And they were a major defense contractor. You would see their names on the transmitter stuff out at Montauk, when you could see that these equipment was from there. So he worked for that company, and he did not want me to put in the book that he worked there. So when I visited him, I told him I was doing the book, and I said, I'm going to put Airborne Instruments Library. And he says, Airborne Instruments Laboratory. He says, I don't know if that's a good idea. I said, Preston, nobody cares anymore. Nobody cares. It's 25 years later, and he goes, okay, because he's still living in the past. Part of it. And then I said, it also says in the book, which you told me personally, that you wrote you had signed a 30-year non-disclosure agreement about the Philadelphia experiment. Now, he had studied the Philadelphia experiment when he worked at Airborne Instruments Laboratory. And people had said this, he knew it, but he couldn't talk about it. A lot of it had to do with the stealth technology, and he couldn't talk about the stealth technology. And he said, so I said, your 30-year non-disclosure agreement is up. He goes, it was 50. And it wasn't 50. He's hiding. He's holding on to the old mindset that he was. I mean, he endured a lot of trauma. So I didn't take it any further. I wasn't going to get anything more out of him. And, I just, okay, and tell the stories. And now he's passed on. But he was a great contributive factor to my life. And he really helped me. He helped a lot of people, too. And remind me to send you his obituary, which I wrote in my newsletter after the show, because he helped people that had weird stuff going on, that they couldn't understand what was going on in their lives. Like they would just, see the sky open up and see weird things, and they'd feel weird. And basically what this is the myelin sheathing in their brain, which covers it, is vulnerable for whatever reason. And he'd say to one guy, you were opened up by the government. Wow. He says, well, and then he says, what do I do? And Preston would teach him to put aluminum foil in his room, coat his room with aluminum foil. And that would knock out the interference. This is what's the equivalent of a Faraday cage in regular electronics. It's called a Faraday cage. An aluminum will serve. Copper is better. But, people aren't going to put copper in their room. So he teaches them aluminum foil. Now, this is where the whole idea of what they call a tinfoil hat conspiracy theorist comes from. Because if you put a tinfoil, you'll stop the frequencies from coming in and protect your myelin sheathing.
Right.
Where it's actually an insensitive criticism, because there are a certain amount of people that suffer from that. So, of course, most of us don't suffer from that. Most of us don't. And even if you don't have severely compromised myelin sheathing, you can just be sensitive, and that will knock it off. But by and large, people don't need to do that. And so, but they don't even understand why they use this term tinfoil hat. And many people who do indulge in conspiracy are crazy. So it's,
Right. So who gets picked? Who gets picked to receive the frequencies that disrupt the myelin sheathing of the brain? How do you get picked for that?
Well, that's kind of like if somebody walks into a bar and maybe they're particularly striking or handsome, and there's all these different women, which one gets picked? It's like the one with the radar. You know what I'm saying? The one that that links it up to.
I got it.
It's like who is vulnerable, who is open. It's there could be a multitude of factors.
Yeah.
Chance.
You can say that everybody is on the radar, but only the ones that had the receiver turned on is the one that is picked, more or less, isn't it?
Right. And Preston Nichols said many times, he says, no form of mind control is universally workable on everyone.
Yeah.
And then that which works in the 1960s might not work in the 1980s. In the 1990s, we had the phenomena of black helicopters, particularly on Long Island. Mm-hmm. And there was a book written by Jim Keith, Black Helicopters. It was not particularly well written, and it was just kind of sloppily put together at the insistence of his publisher, Ron Bond. But the book sold like hotcakes because of the subject. Mm-hmm. And it sold largely to a fundamentalist Christian audience, although it was embraced and sold well in the conspiracy audience. Mm-hmm. So because of course, these black helicopters would come over Long Island. They would come over at particular times. And Preston explained that there was only one type of black helicopter that came out of New Haven, Connecticut, based there that was actually that was particularly significant, he said, and it had a spectrum analyzer that could detect if you were thinking certain types of thoughts and could jam the frequency. This is very general, but I would see these things routinely. They would appear sometimes at Montauk when you're out there investigating. And this black helicopter technology, because you don't see them anymore, they were also replaced by more of the cell phone technology. So the surveillance, they don't need the black helicopters anymore.
I remember Al Bielek. I've done 9 interviews with Al Bielek about some 10, 12 years, 15 years ago. And he talked about the black helicopters, and he thought there were 2 different kinds of it. One of them was the government, which they had actually admitted that they did use. And he said also there was an alien influence that took on that particular shape in order to kind of be camouflaged and still be able to fly around and observe.
Yeah.
Okay. What do you think of that?
Well, anything's possible, and what all of this amounts to is sort of a imposition or interference on your own psychology. That's what all of this stuff is. It's like, why do we have to sit and talk about the Montauk Project? You know what I'm saying? Because it's something that we've all been, or something similar that we've all been inundated with. That's why we have to talk about it. But ideally, we're talking about more extroverted things and how are we going to build a better world? Well, this was at the same time those were at their height. the HAARP technology was evolving.
Wow.
Yes. Yes, in fact, it's said in the appendix, because Preston was watching during the first Gulf War. They were asking the whoever it was, I think it was a general, it might have been one of the defense secretaries, saying, how did you get these Iraqis to surrender out of the bunker? How did you get them to come out of the bunker and surrender? Because they all just surrendered like milquetoast. They were the elite Republican Corps of Saddam Hussein. And he says, well, you know, we brought in the psychological helicopter, excuse me, the psychological helicopters, his voice caught. And wow. he changed his tune. He caught himself. So, yeah, I mean, it's not, I mean, listen, it can be proven. It has been proven. You can beam frequencies of people and change the moods of people. You can frighten them. You can do all sorts of things. And you know, they're playing for real marbles. They're in war. It's not messing around.
There also is a formal black helicopter that I have had a close-up look at. I flew for a living for 23 years, and there was one time in Grand Island, Nebraska, I had a stopover there, and there was a black helicopter sitting on the ramp, and I walked up to it, and there was a guard standing in the kind of like a gasoline shack, not far. So as soon as I walked up to it, he came walking up to the helicopter also, and I could see the paint on the helicopter was black, but it was thin. I could see through it. I could see U.S. Air Force underneath the paint, but from a distance, it looked black. So this helicopter was an Air Force helicopter that was painted black, and there were no insignia on it. There were no numbers on it. And
they technically did it that way because that way it was legal, and they could say, well, see, it's painted here, but you just couldn't see it.
Yeah. And I asked him how they could, you know, you don't have any tail numbers on it. How can that be? He says, we're military, don't worry about it, or something like that, he said.
Yeah, they're not accountable.
Yeah,
they're not accountable. So back in 1972, what inspired this? I mean, who had the big idea? Like, hey, let's do psyops or whatever it's really called. Let's do all the things that happened at Montauk.
Well, it's an amalgam of different things, but it was the research from the Philadelphia experiment and trying to control. It originally started with the human factor studies of the Philadelphia experiment. Why did mankind go wacko, subjected? So they began empirical research. Now, where it opens doors. Like I said, how my life was a setup to write this book. Well, other things are being set up and other people take advantage of different things. It evolved into time travel. And I think it's probably most efficient to get the most bang for the buck here is what happened during the investigation of all this. I mean, you go back and a lot of it's cloaked in mystery.
Yes.
And you can talk about it for hours and people will talk stories like maybe they're making it up, maybe they're not. But when I began to investigate this project, and I go into it in 120 pages, because this is me writing the last 120 pages of, I heard the Montauk Project story from Preston, and we investigated it together. But I also found my own threads that sort of beat to a different tune. But we made many trips out there, and I talk about them in the book. And the thing is, there's an occult investigation in the book, which talks about the occult investigation, which led to the discovery that there were ancient pyramids out there. And I have pictures of the pyramids. Wow. And that was through an occult investigation. There was also a journalistic investigation, which we both participated in. Going out there, we found out they were experimenting with live radar out there in 1993. We have videos of it, altering the patterns of birds in the sky. This is in the Montauk Tour #2. This will be put into a documentary at some point in the future. But yeah, so there's a journalistic investigation, and then the whole base was operating under secrecy, clandestine. There were still people out there. It was operating under the auspices of New York State. So this investigation, and I go into it in the book, talks about how we actually got New York State to change their position on that part. They had blocked off most of it. So we pointed out that it was against the law to do that. They completely changed their tune. They opened it up to the public. This took, a process of 10 years or so.
Yes.
And we were directly responsible for it by raising all these issues. People were going out there and exploring. And these facts have been completely ignored by a documentary that was done by the History Channel. Completely ignored, and completely ignored my participation in it. Although I participated in the documentary, they did not show any of my talk. They showed the book, but they hid my name from the book. So they were trying to take me out of it. And the documentary they did was not very representative of what the story really was. Now, the most spectacular thing that happened in all of this investigation was, we had set up what was called Montauk Night, which would meet once a month at a friend of mine's house in Belmore, Long Island. And we would give information to the public and get back information from the public. And one day, a man showed up. Dr. David Anderson showed up at one of these meetings. And I knew who he was when he introduced himself to me after the meeting. He had said he was a scientist, but when he talked to me, I knew who he was because he was already a subscriber to my newsletter, the Montauk Pulse. I've had a newsletter in circulation since 1993. Every quarter, I put out a newsletter. And this man was experimenting with time travel on a minor scale. He said he had the size of a soccer ball. He could slow time down and speed it up. And I go, in this new book, the Silver Anniversary Edition of the Montauk Project, I actually go into the mechanics of how it works.
Really?
And this took a long time for me to learn. I met him in 1999, and he invited me to Romania then, a few years later, but I didn't go until 2008. And in 2009, I returned to Romania when he lectured extensively on time travel and how he did things. In 2010, he announced that he could put people into his technology and move people in time.
Really?
And he did show us at Montauk in April of 2010, he showed us a video of an early prototype of his machine, which would show a plant, amaryllis plant, growing in 3 minutes, what would normally take 3 days. Wow. He said that I couldn't video it, but I saw it with about 20 other people. And this was the most definitive proof. But if you go to the Time Travel Education Center, there's 7 free videos that explain the science and physics of time travel on a level that a reasonably intelligent junior high school student can understand. And if you're an adult, you might need to go over it a couple times. But I put it into simplicity. Dr. Anderson had a website, and the website was a repetition of what I'd learned in Romania years earlier. But one day I sat down and just put it together, and I put it together so simply that he was very impressed with it. I then did videos to make it even simpler. This is fantastic because it completely closes the door on the science of time travel being possible. The problem we have now is the power issues surrounding it and the censorship surrounding it. Mm-hmm. So we don't have access to it. This is the main where the research log jams.
In your opinion on that particular issue, do you think that that device that he had perfected, was that entirely physical, technical, or did the person's mind have something to do with it working?
It was physical and technical. And what he did say, I one time asked him in a radio interview, I said, what's the most funniest thing you've ever seen in all of your time? I just asked him that. And he says, well, what it is when somebody would actually be subjected to the field or see it in action, they would often begin to just laugh because it was suspending reality for them. So they would see that reality is all an illusion.
Wow.
Yeah.
Not the word he used, but it's the same effect. So they would see that, wow, it's all this. Now, this presents other issues. This is not the same as somebody talking about their unusual experiences, because we're taking, it's an objective situation. Now, what he is subjected to as an individual, I can't really answer for. But when I did meet with him in 2003, no, it was after, when did 9/11? It was right after 9/11, 2001. I'd only known him 3 years. And he invited me over to his apartment in Kings Park, Long Island. And he says, you're only the second person to be here.
Wow.
And it was a nice apartment. It was modest, 2 bedrooms. And the reason he called me there was for 2 reasons. He wanted to plan an event, do a big time travel event, and help make my work known. He also wanted to tell me that he was asked to go away. He was told to report to Moscow, because when you're in the Air Force, which he was, you always can be called back. And he says, I'm going to go to the he says, they want me to go to Moscow and to bring my ticket and my passport, nothing else.
Wow.
So he says, if I don't come back in 2 weeks, make a lot of noise because I don't trust them.
Wow.
He didn't come back for 3 weeks.
Wow.
Then I got a phone call after 3 weeks from the other person who'd been in the apartment and said, if he didn't come back, call me. I'm supposed to call you. Then I started making noise, and he, because I have some sort of public mouthpiece, but it's not that big, but it was better than nothing for him. Mm-hmm. So anyway, he wrote to us and said he'd be okay. He was okay, and that he'd come back in a week. He didn't come back until another month.
Wow.
But we had the email traced to Pakistan. He still will not talk about, he can't talk about that it was from Pakistan or it wasn't from Pakistan. It had to be in conjunction with the invasion of what we were invading, Afghanistan, I would assume.
Mm.
But then he later said that he opened up, or he evolved his technology to the point where he created something called a temporal tremor detector.
Wow.
And he could see when other people were experimenting in time. So like if he saw that the Chinese or the Indians or the Japanese were experimenting in time, he could go knock on their door and say, we know you're doing this. And they say, how do you know? And he would have a certain seniority in terms of technology, completely aside from his government association. Now, when I was in his apartment that evening, I said to him something about the Chinese and their Christmas cards. They send out New Year's cards because they're not really Christian. And I said, it's very odd. I get this Christmas card from the Chinese publishers like years after I've met them, like years. And he says, yeah, I have a bunch of cards. Let me show you. And he takes me over to his fireplace, and he's got all these cards, and they're all from world leaders.
Wow.
And they're to the Time Travel Research Center, which was the name of his company.
Wow.
Colonel Gaddafi was one of them. And they, he had some sort of official correspondence or Christmas card correspondence. And he told me that he met with several world leaders, and he said that he was always struck by how inadequate they felt to do their position. They felt very modest, and they didn't know how they got in this position, and they tried their best to do the best. And it was very difficult and very challenging. So he is somebody who, has been known to cavort with world leaders.
Yes.
Very interesting man. And he tends to thrive on a very humble life, where he'll go out to the mountains and, spend Christmas out at the mountains by himself. For a short period of time, when he showed us the video, he was living in the Kodak plant up in Rochester, which was completely abandoned. And he said he had a small room, but he was very happy because he was able to work exclusively on his research.
Wow.
This made him happy.
I bet he was very soothing to world leaders with what he knew, and for people who didn't know how they got into what they were into.
I don't really know, but it's I think his life is a double-edged sword with all of his knowledge. He also said when I first met him that he kept his technology very compartmentalized because he'd have to hire scientists and whatnot, and he didn't necessarily want the left arm to know what the right arm was doing, because otherwise they, could have the potential to take his technology, which is proprietary, but it's also, when you're that secure,
right,
that much into the security thing, you become partners with the government, whether you like it or not.
Say, Peter.
Also, let me just say one thing. In this book, I have his patent application for the time reactor.
Wow.
That's part of the explanation. It's an actual, and he has some other 15 patents, which I haven't seen.
Wow.
Can you outline in kind of crayon terms what the principle was you said has finally been put to rest? I think you said that, and I was like, immediately, I was like, okay, yeah.
Okay. That's a series of 7 videos you can access for free. You just have to put in your email at the Time Travel Education Center. And it begins with something called the invariance of the space-time interval. Now, the invariance of the space-time interval is in a book called Space-Time Physics by John Archibald Wheeler, who was a friend of David's. And the invariance of the space-time interval is not new to science. But he told me at the time, and he explained this to me. He sat down and tutored me on this personally in a hot space on a communist houseboat in Romania. And he explained this to me, and he says there's only about 4 physicists in the world who really understand this. And I understood it when he explained it to me. But when I got back home, I forgot it. It was almost like I needed to be in his presence. I later went to the library and refigured it out, and so I could own it. The invariance of the space-time interval, which teaches us, and I'm not going to go into the explanation because it took a few videos to explain this, and it's based upon the Pythagorean theorem. But basically what it demonstrates is that time is distance. And I can explain it to you. If you look at the definition of time, it's not distance in the dictionary, but it is distance if you look at a sundial and you look at the shadow, and the shadow has moved from this point to that point. That gives you an idea that time is distance. But it's not distance in the 3 dimensions, it's distance in 4 dimensions. So you have to extend it outwards. It's not that hard to visualize, but I go into the mechanical proofs of it based upon the Pythagorean theorem and the speed of light. It's too cumbersome to explain verbally. But anybody can go there. And this is just saying that time is distance. Now he's saying that because time is distance, we can use algebraic equations to compute it and figure it out. That was the first step, he said. And there's further explanations which are kind of hand-fed on the videos, explaining the difference between what Newtonian mechanics are, only confined to a sphere.
Yeah.
The spin of the Earth. So that's Newtonian mechanics. When there's a time differential with when you spin a piece of mass, like a planet, and you spin it, and then there's the time on the inside is different than the time on the outside. But it's very infinitesimal. Very infinitesimal. However, that infinitesimal part is not insignificant. So it also creates tremendous discharge. There's also, if you have 2 time reactors, which is what he calls his device, or time reaction phenomena, you have a massive discharge of energy. And I've got videos on this on the website, and they're also on YouTube, which talk about the legitimacy of creating not free energy, but very inexpensive energy. This solves the world's energy problems. The problem is implementation.
Yeah.
And
now
willingness.
You made kind of a leap there, Peter. So you went immediately from time travel to free energy. What is that? Can you kind of outline that a little bit, a little more detail on that?
It's in the videos.
Oh, it's in the videos. Okay.
It's in the videos because you see, it's not free, but it's almost as good as free. You know, Preston never liked the word free because you'd hear so many cockeyed theories about it. And it's called space-time motive force. That's a term that he coined. And I go into this in very simple detail. What he did tell me, now this is interesting as we parlay into Romania, because he took me to Romania.
And this is David?
Yeah. He took me to Romania or financed my trip in 2008. And then I went back in the following year. And then I kept getting dragged back there by different people who wanted me to go with them. And I wouldn't say dragged, but Romania is one of the most undiscovered secrets in the world.
Yes.
And that, and just to keep it in context, in 2015, we did a radio interview together. It was long. And there was a lot of problems getting it going, so we had these long conversations, some of the most interesting conversations I'd ever had with him. And I said, can you please tell me about Romania? What is the connection with Romania from your perspective? Because I've written books about Romania, which I haven't mentioned. However, he said, I don't know if I can talk about that. And he comes back the next conversation. He says, well, this is what I can tell you, but don't say anything, don't publish it. Then he comes back in the actual conversation, the interview, and he does say it. So he does say it. And he says, there is a cave in Romania, Chaklavina cave in Romania, he says, that has the evidence of the highest amount of discharge of space-time motive force in the world. He says, this is the biggest source of evidence of time travel having occurred. And I said, well, David, you'd be very surprised to know that I was at that cave last summer. And I was at the cave with the woman who was to become my wife. And the only reason I went to the cave is because an archaeologist took me there, who the owner of the hotel wanted me to meet. I am actually a legend in the hills of Transylvania.
Wow.
My name is.
I've heard that because my co-host on the other radio show is from Romania, so I heard that.
I'm actually a legend there, and so anyway, he took me there with some other friends, and we just went to the cave, and he told us the stories about the cave, and it was full of bat guano, and the bat guano is very expensive for two reasons. One is it can be used for explosive. Roads were built to the cave by the former dictator, Ceausescu, for explosives purposes. So there is a road, a very rough road to it. The cave, and now the bat guano is sought out for growing and plants and marijuana and things like that. It's super high grade feces, and it's bat feces. So anyway, David, when he found out that I'd been there, was really surprised. Like, what on the hell are you doing there? You know what I'm saying? Like, he wanted to know how close it was to the other sacred site in Romania, Sarmisegetuza, which I told him about. He was fascinated. Like, how did I end up there? So I've gone back there twice since then. And I wouldn't have gone back because I didn't know it was important. I was taken there. I didn't ask to go. I just went along with the archaeologist. I said, okay, we have another day. Okay, I'll go. And I went back and I found another entrance to the cave, which couldn't get in because it was metal door. I went back last year and the metal door had been opened by a friend of mine in Romania, who's a high-level Freemason and a member of the Knights of Malta. I said, is it through your Masonic connections? And he just smiled. He wouldn't answer. But he got into the cave and he showed me videos of it. He brought several other people with him. He said one person had a weird experience. He says he didn't want any of us to go in the cave for our own safety. And when we got to the cave, and of course, he found a bunch of bones in there. He said that the bones were, some of them were bare bones. He went in 3 kilometers into the cave. He found a bunch of bare bones, and he found bones which he said belonged to a giant. Now, he is a naturopath. He's a doctor, not a medical doctor, but he knows something about the anatomy. He said they were definitely bones. Mm-hmm. You can't tell from the pictures. But he said that he wouldn't just take these bones or touch them because he wouldn't take them back to analyze because it's a cemetery, and he respected the cemetery. So we went back, and we couldn't, the door was closed. Now, it's possible to get in through the door if you apply to the right cave explorers and whatnot. You know, maybe you can get into the cave. I don't know how important it is to get into the cave. I made some contacts near the cave, which I plan to return to, where I'll learn a lot more about the legends and the stories and the area. I would like to spend days near the cave. Wow. So I've had 3 adventures there, and hope to do a 4th one.
What, is there a white bat, really? Or
is there a what?
Is there a white bat?
Well, I wrote a book called The White Bat, and this
I know.
Because I'm sure there are white bats in that cave. I had my mother-in-law show me pictures of white bats. This is on the internet. I've never been able to see them since, that exist in Transylvania that are not known to zoology.
Amazing.
Because my book, The White Bat, is about a dream. I was being called to Romania back in 1989. Before I got involved in Montauk, I had a dream of Dracula turning into a white bat. And so then, you know, all of this sort of comes full circle to the fact that a woman saw a white bat. When I got there in 2013, she said that she'd seen a white bat. I'm telling this group of Romanians about my adventures, and that I was working on a book called The White Bat. And she says, well, I saw a white bat in this cave. And that was interesting. That was not this cave. It was another cave. So I would imagine there's several white bats in different caves there.
Amazing. Amazing.
We go deeper, but we won't go there right now.
Okay.
Yeah. Lead us to the holographic library in
Please.
cave, I suppose.
Okay. So around in 2003 was the anniversary of the Montauk Project, the 20-year anniversary of the Montauk Project, 2003. It was also the 60th anniversary of the Philadelphia experiment, August 12th, August 12th is the date of a very substantial biorhythm. It's recognized since the days of Napoleon and even earlier, when Sirius is at its peak, or it's closest to the Earth. And this is the high holy days of Egypt. And they were days of fertility. August 12th was the birthday of Isis. And this is why Napoleon went in the Great Pyramid, the King's Chamber, on August 12th. So it was actually, the biorhythm runs from August 10th to August 14th. Preston taught me this. Now, but he wasn't the only one to recognize this biorhythm, of course, going back to the ancient Egyptians. David Anderson came into my life on the night of a full eclipse on August 11th. He came right into my life on the biorhythm. 10 years from that day, I was on my first trip to the holy site of Transylvania, Sarmisegetusa. That night, before I went, I was staying at a monastery. And the monastery, one of the monks came out and was talking to my friend in Romanian that the foundational stone of this monastery was put down on the full eclipse 10 years earlier, the day I met David Anderson. Mm-hmm. So, we did get a phone call from David Anderson on my friend's phone because she had a cell phone. I didn't. And saying, I wish I could be with you. I can't be with you, but I wish I could be on this journey with you. So we had this, and I was visiting the holy site on that anniversary. Now, all of my trips, most of them to sacred Transylvania, occur on that biorhythm. And it's not because I choose it. It's because the logistics of the camp I go to teach at meets at a certain time. And it's even been backed up, so I'm more inclined to be there during that time. So yes, I was introduced to the cave on that anniversary, but I don't particularly say I'm going on this day. It just works out that way. Mm-hmm. So anyway, on August of 2003, we were all waiting for the great biorhythm to happen. Like, what's going to happen? In 1943 was the Philadelphia experiment. In 1963, there was a project on Long Island, Brentwood, Long Island, called the Brentwood ITT project, which I now know was a forerunner of the HAARP project. The 1983 was the Montauk Project. So what's going to happen in 2003? Well, on 2003, Al Bielek had predicted on Coast to Coast Radio that there would be a major blackout on these dates from the 10th to the 14th. Well, the date was the 14th when there was the biggest blackout in the history of, I think, America occurred in New York. And it extended out to Ohio, Pennsylvania, Massachusetts. The center of the blackout was Preston Nichols' new property in Cairo, New York, which is not 40 minutes from Albany. That was the equidistant center of it. So that was what we thought was the big happening, and it certainly was a big happening. At the same time, I didn't know this. There was a Romanian-American expedition into a chamber beneath the Romanian Sphinx. Now, most people aren't aware there is a Sphinx in Romania. And it's not exactly the same like the Sphinx in Egypt. It's a rock formation that from a particular vantage point looks exactly like a Sphinx. The other side of it looks like a griffin, but it's not as clear. Of course, underneath the Sphinx, deep into the ground, they burrowed and found a chamber, a joint team of Americans and Romanians. And they found a holographic chamber, and the holographic chamber, well, there was a lot of drama to get to this, a lot of conspiracy, intrigue, government negotiations. But when they finally get to what they call the projection hall, it has these tables where you can put your hand over one part of the table and it'll read out your DNA. And then if you put it closer to the table, it'll be more microscopic readout of your DNA to the molecular and finally the atomic level. If you put your hand on another table or another part of the table, I don't remember which is which, it'll read out the DNA of another species. It'll read out the holography of another planetary system, which says where the species comes from. If you put it over another part of the table, it'll show you another species. If you put them on simultaneously, it'll show you a hybridization of the two species. This is like all the permutations of DNA. So this was fascinating. It's a Noah's Ark in a high-tech format. The technology was assumed to be 50,000 years old. Now, everything that is in that book, the first book of this series, Transylvania Sunrise, all that information was about 6 weeks of exploration. It's based upon 6 weeks of exploring this chamber. There's also a part of the chamber where you can see the history of the world, but it's a synthesized history based upon your own bioresonance. So you'll see a different history than I will, than he will, etc. And it was condensed into about 45 minutes for the author, and he saw all sorts of stuff, which sort of blew his mind.
Well, why would it be, just real quick, maybe elaborate a little bit on why it would be individual?
Well, we have to go back to radar. You send out a signal and you get a feedback. This is what this is. It's you go into the, I don't know if it's a chair or what, but you go into a screen and you're there. It's reading you. You're sending out a signal and it's feeding you back. It's obviously very sophisticated beyond what we're familiar with.
And it reads your timeline.
It's a smart projector. Yeah, it's sort of like if you put input data into a computer, they want to know all about you and then they feed back things to you. The computer does. Like, what movies you like, it'll feed back. I want to watch movies about vampires. You've written all these vampires. They know that you like vampire movies, so they feed back vampire movies. Only this is much more sophisticated. It's probably reading your DNA, your blueprint, and telling you, what you might be more interested or inclined to. It can even read your interests. So in other words, if you're getting more history of Ireland and England because your DNA is English and Irish as opposed to Chinese, no. But maybe you're interested in Chinese. So maybe you get a lot of Chinese history even though you're not of Chinese blood because you're interested in it. So it's going to play off what's in your mind.
Amazing.
It's basically got a mind capable of reading the mind. Now, one of the most interesting aspects of this projection hall is there's 3 tunnels inside. And the 3 tunnels are very mysterious. One of them leads to Egypt, where there's a similar structure. Not the same, similar. That's the subject of book 3, Mystery of Egypt. There's another tunnel that leads to Tibet, with an offshoot to Mongolia and Baghdad, or by way of Baghdad. And they have similar installations in Mongolia, Baghdad, and Tibet. The prime one, the flagship installation, is in Romania, according to the author. The other tunnel is what the subject of this new book is, Inside the Earth. The second tunnel goes to the inner Earth. And that might be the most interesting thing, because in this book, we get a whole new look at what is meant by inner Earth. It's not hollow Earth, but anyway, go ahead.
Wow. I'm going to so buy all your books now. So is there anything you can tell us about holographic technology that you've learned from all of your study and analysis?
Well, I wouldn't call myself a student of holographic technology. What I was told by a friend of mine who's very astute when it comes to computers, and he said this to me, God, probably 15 years ago. He said, we're about 30 years away from being able to have holographic technology.
Really?
Now, what also can tell you about it, I can't tell you the mechanics, that he's talking from a technical standpoint. I can also tell you from a more inside perspective, which isn't necessarily, it's only me having info from people who are on the inside, that this technology is, and when what's in the books is already evolved. It's already there. It's a question of access. So everything, the great mystery in life is about access. And I'm working on a book right now that's available to paid subscribers on my website. It's only up to chapter 12 or so. It's called L. Ron Hubbard, The Tao of Insanity. Tao being T-A-O. And I haven't introduced in this book, but the whole thing with when you study something, and it could be on any subject, it has to do with 3 factors. They can break down into subdivisions. It has to do with intelligence. It has to do with access. And it has to do with fortune or fate or good luck. In other words, those 3 factors are present. Being intelligent is not enough. You have to have access.
Right.
Like, you could be intelligent, but if you don't have access to what's going in the stock market, you can't do it. You got to know the inside dope of what people are doing. Yeah. Intelligence is not enough. Access. And then there's good fortune, which also applies to the stock market. You've got to, some people are meant to do it. Some people are not meant to do it. So all of these points. And so when you parlay this into what we're talking about here, like time travel or all of this incredible holographic technology, access.
I understand also that inside that cavern in Romania where the holographic library was, those tables, they were pretty tall. They could only be worked by a giant of maybe 12, 15 foot tall standing next to it. Otherwise, you would have to have ladders to get up there.
Yeah, well, they did. They I think the table was 6 foot high, so, or 6 meters high. So you'd have to get up on a table, and that's how they would do it.
Yeah.
And, these are incredible stories. And in this, and of course, the author of the book, Radu Sinamar, is somebody who was a musician who was recruited to do this and write these books. And I've had a sporadic correspondence with him over the years. Didn't hear from him for I only heard from him last June. I hadn't heard from him 6 years or something. And I told him, and he said, one of the things he answered a question that I'd asked him a year earlier. It was a personal question. And I asked him, and he asked me, he says, why haven't you published the book? It came out 2 years ago. And he says, don't you like it? And I wrote back and I said, no, I like it very much. I said, there's been a lot of issues. And I sent him the epilogue. And in the epilogue, I say that I've been in publishing for 25 years, and I've never had so much difficulty getting a book done.
Interesting. Producing
a book. And it starts with the publisher not answering my emails, eventually saying, why haven't you done the new book? And because you don't answer my emails, give me the goddamn book.
Right.
And I finally got, my mother-in-law brought me 5 copies of the book, which I asked her when she came over to visit. So I had to, scan the book. And then my translator was pregnant. She couldn't do the book. My wife didn't have time. She's Romanian, but she didn't have time to do it. She tried, but she helped me, but it didn't. And then the woman I picked was a friend who actually attended David Anderson's lecture with me. She was a high school student at the time. And I picked her to do it because I had nobody else. And great deal of time and difficulty with her translation because she's not really a professional. So I ended up doing that. And finally, the publisher sent me a year later the actual graphic files. And I was able to do Google Translate with hers. It was very cumbersome. And then if I didn't understand either one of them, I'd go to my wife and ask her.
Yes.
So it was very difficult. It's very hard to put the language from Romanian into sputtered English and then into intelligible English. So far, everybody's really liked the way it comes out because you can read it. So I did a lot of work on this. I was given a nice acknowledgement, not only by the author, but by his boss who works, he's kind of the head of Department Zero and an ambassador to the Inside the Earth people, which is a civilization down there, according to this book, which are fascinating.
Wow.
But they're not quite in this dimension.
But does
not quite.
Does this information you have about inner Earth civilizations, does it align with the stuff that Corey Goode has said?
I would take Corey Goode and shove him down the garbage, or at least what he has to say. I wouldn't shove him down as a human being. I just don't. No, I'm not. No, I don't. Number one, I wouldn't listen to anything he said. I know a lot about his history, and I don't go there. I'm not a follower. I'm not a listener. I know him or David Wilcock. They're not what people think they are. Anyway. I'm not on board with anything they say.
Well, is there a particular reason why you would say that?
There are a lot of reasons.
Yeah.
Well, but we'd be curious.
Well, I'll tell you the first time I ever heard of David Wilcock, he's holding my book up and talking about it, like he knows something about it. When he is not only the spitting image of somebody who was programmed at Montauk with the blue eyes and the blonde hair.
Oh, really?
Wow. Spitting image of a Montauk programmee. Mm-hmm. He's writing this book to fame, and he's saying, well, the other books are disinformation. I mean, he's basically, he's saying I'm a disinformant, basically.
Wow.
Not overtly. But you can, there's all sorts of stuff on him in the things he's done of doing false psychic readings, taking money for them, not refunding them, and not having any ability whatsoever.
Yeah, I know there's some controversy there.
He's a profile of a scam artist. He also claimed he was Edgar Cayce. And,
I've heard him talk about that he believes he may be the reincarnation of Edgar Cayce, which that's fine if you want to believe that.
It's preposterous.
Yeah.
Because he's nothing like Edgar Cayce. Aside from, it's just somebody trying to, people say I am.
He looked like him when he was younger. Yeah.
Shit. And see, people, this is a problem because one of my friends said, Well, somebody had to be. Well, I don't know if somebody had to be. It certainly wasn't him. I mean, people just, they don't question. And
exactly.
you have to look at who supports him. I'm not going to go into the whole story of how he got his start, but it's like he's propped up by the wrong people.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
but it's a waste of energy and time to talk about him.
Okay,
that's fine. Yeah, no problem.
I agree.
We were just I was just curious.
Corey Good. It has nothing to do with Corey Good. However, what this has to do with is the first thing Radu, when he goes into the inner earth, before he's going to go on this trip, he's taught specifically by a Tibetan Lama who enters the fold in all of this. It's a Tibetan Lama who kind of orchestrates the whole unveiling of this. And he gives Radu lectures on black holes and that how a black hole is really not what people think it is. Science thinks it's basically a great sucking vacuum that sucks in everything. Stephen Hawking kind of became famous when he said that black holes do emit a certain signal.
Yes, they do.
Stephen Hawking was very limited. That's another problem. But anyway, that's what he's famous for, and he was not incorrect.
Well, they found scientifically that there are things being ejected from black holes, and so it completely that the logic fails the whole idea that it's just a vacuum cleaner.
Well, yes, but see, it's much more than that. And I'm going to give you a quote from the book here. Basically, he's saying that planets, stars, everything out there in the heaven manifests through the phenomena of a black hole. So you'll listen to this and, you don't have to agree with it. It's not even my information, but it's interesting and it'll give you another perspective. Water is created by the dynamic of black holes and water in cosmic space. It's not necessarily exactly the same as water as you kick out of a tap, but it's not that difference. He says, you're creating water begins with a condensation of subtle water from the etheric plane through the dynamic rotation of a black hole. So here you have water condensing through the rotation of a black hole. In the material plane, this condensation appears like an expulsion from the black hole's vortex, and right next to it, water is manifested in the shape of ice. So water exists in cosmic space and in huge amounts. Even astrophysicists have noticed it, having a big surprise when they do. You cannot, however, expect for it to be like potable water because it has special properties. It is, however, water. You will find the same process inside the Earth. The water is condensed beyond the dynamic of the black hole that emanates from the center of the planet. It's amazing. I know this is contrary to typical scientific notions and dogma, and while everything seems to be phantasmagorical, it is obvious and simple enough if you make an effort to overcome the initial shock. Then you should no longer be surprised over the prospect of a black hole residing in the center of the Earth. Any structure, no matter how big or small, is based upon the same fundamental principle. There is a black hole vortex in the center, and this is a principle of creation, just as is the principle of absorption, which applies at the end of its existence. Any galaxy has at its center a black hole. Any atom has in its nucleus a tiny black hole that ensures its existence and manifestation of evolution. Don't guide yourself under the contemporary scientific paradigm. The way it sees the world is still at a relatively modest level, which is focused on either the quantifiable universe or the microcosmic aspect because it is limited to a purely materialistic understanding of things. That's a diatribe on black holes. Mm-hmm. And this is a foundational understanding he is given because the inside of the Earth, the black sun in the side of the Earth, is indeed a black hole. It's not a black sun per se. It's not a sun like our sun. And there's all sorts of creation that manifests from it, and it's in a different context. When you go in, according to this book, when you go into the Earth, you're going to hit not, what do they call that? Fiery furnace, a fiery center, molten.
The molten nickel core.
No, and he goes into this.
Yeah.
he goes into it scientifically on how all of the assumptions on that are based upon assumptions. It's all assumptions. It's not science.
That's right.
Something called the Cavendish experiment.
So do you feel that maybe ETs are using our own planet then as a portal?
No, I don't feel that. But ETs are a whole nother breed of fish. But we're talking about intraterrestrial characters. And and of course, not everything in the interior is necessarily good. But, you know, as you go into the Earth, there are pockets of, I guess what you'd say, I want to call
Caverns.
them lodes, places that are actually in the physical plane, that where there's civilizations because of all the different phenomena that goes on down there. I can't even remember to tell you. It's described in the book, but you know, you can have energy where there are hot, you know, like virtual suns down there. They're not suns. There's light, there's heat, and there's different types of beings down there that have evolved. As you get deeper, you get into water.
Curious.
And you're getting
now that you brought it up, a little bit curious about how do you know this? What's telling you this?
I don't know it. This is what's in the book.
Ah.
It's not me. I'm not the one having the adventures. Everything is based on a scientific logic. It's not going to prove everything for you, but there's tremendous logic in this book. In fact, it answers so many questions and it changes the paradigm. Ultimately, as you get down into the earth, you're going to change. You're going to shift, experience a dimensional shift where you're in a completely different region. And of course, it's like, how do I describe it? It's kind of surrealistic. And there's actually conscious down there. In fact, it'll tell you that the black hole is actually consciousness itself.
Oh, wow.
And that we're manifesting and we're pieces of consciousness. So it's kind of like going in, if, you know, there's that movie with Isaac Asimov on his book called The Incredible Journey Going into the Human Body.
Yeah.
Okay. They're just going around through veins and arteries and stuff. But if you were to get to the center in that of the brain, it's like, wow, you find, hey, this is me. They're going on some stupid ass science fiction journey in the movie. I haven't read the book. But anyway, if you went into a human body and you got into the brain, wow.
Wow.
Yeah.
But let's take it deeper. You go not just into the I, who you are. Inside of your body is incredible intelligence. We don't even have to go into the realms of God or divinity. We can just say scientifically, when you know, somebody can take a tab of LSD and see all this incredible knowledge and wisdom. It's not, again, accessible unless you take the drug, which is kind of cheating. So anyway, but we know that inside of us is tremendous reservoirs of intelligence. It's the same thing with the earth. Only we're like part of the earth. Gaia is a actual consciousness. Venus is a consciousness. Mars, all these planets are actually individual consciousness. The bigger being is the earth. Gaia, the mother Gaia, is thought of with a lot of reverence, but she really is what we're a part of. You know, so it's like this book integrates so much of that and gives such a radically different view to anything I've ever heard of, let alone read. So a lot of the stuff about it also goes into like, what did happen to Admiral Byrd when he went into the, you know, North Pole and saw these mammoths? It explains what happens.
Nice.
That you actually, there are certain points of the planet where you enter, but you don't enter unless you're resonant with that. You're not going to be allowed in. You might get to a certain part. You might have some experiences, like this guy in the cave I talked about. He wasn't quite ready for it, or he wouldn't have been disoriented. So this is, it didn't kill him, but my friend thought it was very bad. You know, nobody should go.
Wow.
So in other words, it's all a part of one's initiation. And this book is sort of a broad-based initiation for people. And I do know certainly that my books, if nothing else, inspire people. There's also what I've heard is a bit of a cult following of people that have gathered around the Sphinx area in the mountains, and they're living there and they're hanging out, sort of like groupies on the subject. And this is not, I mean, the energy is great up there, but this is not necessarily the way to access anything. Because number one, they could be going to different areas, and it's all about being in tune, not going to a location per se. So I fed you with a lot of information.
Wow. Good stuff.
Oh, that's great, Peter. Absolutely.
Well, I see, in your books, you have a lot more details than build up on what we've been talking about here. So that's probably where really people need to go in order to get the rest of the story, as,
Totally, because it's like I can only, process so much information and feed it into, a sound bite. But yeah, it's like, it'll feed people's muse, and people have been waiting a long time. He hasn't written a book in many years. It's probably been 8 years or more. And the good news is that he wrote to me and said that he would have a new book shortly in maybe in March at the soonest. That I won't have the book in March. I mean, I might get it, but I won't be able to publish it. I mean, that'd be the first I could get my hands on it. And it may not even be that early. And he also said, when he read my epilogue about saying how difficult this book, it took me 2 years after this was published in Romanian to put it into English, 2 years. And I told him of all the difficulty. He said he was having the same difficulty with his 6th book.
What do you make of that? What do you make of that interference? Anything? Or?
It's, you know what? It's like sometimes if you're on a journey, I watched the Super Bowl yesterday, and I noticed I was watching Tom Brady having a hell of a hard time in the first half. He was frustrated. He broke through whatever he had to break through. So now he has eternal greatness, football greatness. But I'm saying is like, you have things, sometimes you're given a lot to overcome, and can you overcome them? And it's the drive and the determination. So he admired my persistence in doing this because he knew, obviously, he could relate to it. And for the people that is really interested in the mechanics of time travel, do you suggest maybe one of the books, or do you think maybe your website, the Time Travel Education Center.com, would be the place to go? TimeTravelEducationCenter.com. And if one wants to be a subscriber, they can have there's 2 things. Explain the basic science and math of it. I have a couple videos of that series, which are only for paid subscribers. One is the patent application, but I've now put that in the book, and you can also download the patent application for free. If you look up patent application time reactor, you can download it on the internet. I've broken that down in the new book, the Montauk Project. I've broken that down because people don't necessarily read it really easily. Although if one's got a good scientific mind, they can digest it. And then on the website, in the paid subscriber section, I have an explanation of how the time reactor works, an actual user-friendly explanation based upon my understanding. And the next, I do plan to do some more work on that series, but it's all about psychology of space-time. We're not talking about mechanics, because the psychology of space-time has to do with dimension. I do have a series called Psychology of Space-Time Dimension, which explains the 10 dimensions. That's quantitative understanding of psychology, not qualitative. The second subject will be power, because all of this time travel, it's incredible power, and people can't deal with power. So when you give people power, they do wrong things with it. So that's a big issue. And the third issue is censorship, which is power and censorship are wrapped in each other.
Mm-hmm.
So if we can, these are the three things we have to peel back, power and censorship, as well as, general psychology of dimension to get at this stuff. And it becomes an individual journey. Yeah. So the technology will appear when it's ready to appear. And David, actually, I haven't posted this, but he wrote to me several years ago and said that he had 15 other patents. And we have, I'm going to be doing courses on time.
And for people that are just tuning in, David, Peter, this is David again. What's it?
Dr. David Anderson.
Dr. David Anderson. Okay.
And he referred to their mastery of time. But since then, nothing came forth. And I ended up doing videos that he couldn't or wouldn't do. So I don't know that they're exactly the same as he would do them, but they're probably much easier to understand.
Yeah.
Say, Peter, we have a question from the chat room, if you would, real quick. I'll just pass it through. One of the folks we have on there is a friend also, Gary with Holidium Labs, and he says, ask Peter if he heard of the Yellow Book or Cave of Durango, Colorado.
The Yellow Book, I've heard of Durango, Colorado, but not a cave. Not about a Yellow Book. No, I don't know anything about that.
Okay, thanks.
If he wants to send me information, he's more than welcome to.
Okay, great. Yeah, and people can contact you through your website as well, I would imagine.
Yes, or petermoon333 at gmail.com, petermoon333 at gmail.com.
Excellent, excellent.
I appreciate your attention to the details of what you're doing and breaking things down into a much needed, easier language. So, and just your journey. I'm so grateful to have met you and spent this time with you. It's amazing.
Thank you. The details are very important. It's very important because people will just talk stuff, and you give somebody too much rope and they keep talking, and that's okay, but it doesn't necessarily come back to a grounded reference point, which is what I always try to do.
Nice.
Yeah.
Really
At
nice.
one point, there's got to be some meat and potatoes in there.
Exactly. So I thank you all for having me. It's been nice talking with you.
Thank you,
Peter. Yes,
I
definitely.
should give the website. We gave also for the books is skybooks.usa.com.
Yeah, so we've got that on our live broadcast right now. It's on the video, so folks can look at the bottom. You'll see both websites there, TimeTravelEducationCenter.com and Skybooks USA are both there for people. So,
thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you,
So
Peter.
much.
And if you would, we're going to end the show, and then if you would stick around for just a few moments after we're gone. So I'm going to go ahead and send our outro out.